So our very lucky first speaker of the day, whose title is Vexed, How to Do Queer History, is a cultural historian, activist and critically acclaimed author, Dermot Hester.
Hello. I'm a bit nervous. I think it's the occasion that's kind of overcome me. I think it was probably Sean's fault. I have to talk about that later with him. So first of all, I want to thank Sean and Kate for inviting me, and it feels like a real honour to speak to you today. It's probably why I'm a little bit nervous, actually. It is a real honour. So the rather grandiose title, Vexed, How to Do Queer History, I hope it doesn't come across as too arrogant, like that there's only one way to do queer history and I'm going to tell you how to do it. But I think it's more like trying to, what I was trying to do with the title was try to open up, try to be as general as possible, really, and to kind of provoke conversations. So that's what I'm trying to do with that. The work that I'm going to talk about today is based on my work as a queer cultural historian. I've worked in the history of gender and sexuality for about 20 years or so. This idea of vexed is something that has kind of driven a lot of the work that I've been doing. It comes from Jose Munoz's exploration of Kevin Aviance, the performance artist's work, where he writes, "Queerness has an especially vexed relationship to evidence." And what Munoz means by this is that there is a sense in which historical evidence of queer lives has gone in a couple of different directions. In the first sense, led largely by the sexology of the 19th century and the discovery of the testimonies of queer people and the kind of mania for taxonomy that took hold in the Victorian era. There has been, let's say, led by the likes of Havelock Ellis, who, regardless of his progressive bent, in works like Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 1, which was a study of sexual inversion. In that book, he collated a number of testimonies, first-hand testimonies of inverted men, homosexual men and their lives, in order to extrapolate some kind of a taxonomy for what constitutes homosexuality, or as he called it, sexual inversion. And so this evidence was used as the basis for his studies in the psychology of sex. But as we know from the work of somebody like Michel Foucault, this evidence that was marshaled by sexologists like Ellis was subsequently kind of hardened into an identity and into something that could then be criminalized and pathologized. So that is one way in which evidence of queer lives has been used. But of course, on the other hand, you know, we all grow up in a heterosexist society, and I think that it's a lot of people can identify with this, that it feels very much like when we go out into the world, we want to find stories and evidence that shores up a sense of ourselves, that gives us stories that we can rely on, that attest to the fact that queer lives have been lived before, that they have been lived happily, perhaps. There are many cases where that's not the case. But I think that this is the success of something like BBC's Gentleman Jack, which is about the life of Anne Lister, of course, the 19th century woman about town, and the real interest in the encoded diaries of Anne Lister, which was decoded and translated at the beginning of the 21st century. I think that So this is another side of this pursuit of queer evidence. So it feels like there is this very much a kind of a vexed relationship to queer evidence, as Munoz talks about. I work at the University of Cambridge, and it would be remiss of me not to use a definition at this point. As an aside, Irish mammies are the most vexed people, aren't they? Aren't they the most? So it feels like maybe this talk is like a tribute to all those Irish mammies who are vexed. You're vexing me. But the definition is to make somebody feel annoyed or frustrated or worried. Sorry, ma. And I like this West Indian also, to be annoyed or irritated or unhappy. I wouldn't vex. And I think that in order to do queer history, you need to kind of retain a sense of that vexation. That considering the history, a potted history of which I've outlined, considering the way that that evidence has been used in the history of queer and non-normative sexuality, I think it's very important to retain that sense of frustration and vexation, and not to assume the self-evidence of evidence. And the work that I've been doing over the past decade has really been focused, some of the work I've been doing, has been really focused on retaining that kind of frustration and interrogating queer histories creatively and critically. And oral histories have been a really big part of this work. And I think that's one of the reasons why it feels, even though I'm not an artist, it feels like what I'm going to talk about is germane to our discussions today. Does anybody know this white woman? Obviously her name is Rosie E. Poole. Does anybody come across her? So Rosie Poole was a Dutch Jew who was born in Amsterdam in 1905. She was, I suppose, notably a tutor of Anne Frank. In the 1930s, she moved to Berlin to study cultural anthropology, and her main focus was the work of African-American artists and writers in New York, predominantly the Harlem Renaissance. She has an absolutely fascinating life. She was interned in one of the camps in World War II and dramatically escaped in a library van, which is worth noting. Librarians are always quite subversive. And became a Dutch resistance fighter during the Second World War. And after the war, she became a major advocate for African-American culture in continental Europe. So, as I say, a really fascinating life, even before I found, with the help of archivists from the University of Sussex, evidence that she was actually gay. I mean, nobody goes to Berlin in the 1930s and doesn't come back gay. Do you know what I mean? So there was a lot of evidence in her archive, which was housed at the University of Sussex, which is housed there, to say that she was part of this lesbian subculture in Berlin, but also toward the end of her life, when she moved to London, she lived with her female companion, good friend, best friend, who was also a woman. In 2017, with a couple of colleagues from the University of Sussex and the performance artist Harold Ofe, I worked on a series of events that would take the story of Rosie Poole's life, and especially this new information that we had found in the archives, and to, as I say, to kind of keep that sense of vexation with how do we tell the story of her life. The events that we did was under the auspices of Being Human, which is a UK-based festival of the humanities. We screened Looking for Langston, which is the connection with Harlem Renaissance, and it was introduced by Isaac Julian. But the main event of the series was what we called a performance lecture entitled They Taught Me Laughing to Keep from Crying, which was a quote from one of Rosie Poole's diaries. And it looked into her relationship with people like Langston Hughes and Owen Dodson and Chester Himes. But the format of it was kind of like a surreal one show. What's RTE's equivalent of the one show? Like, those magazine afternoon shows. The afternoon. We tried to come up with the most banal title, like it's the latest show with Diarmuid and Joe. And to try to kind of, the main focus of this surreal kind of take on the one show, which by the way was done before Alan Partridge did it. Don't know if that's a reference that will land here, but anyway. And the main focus was a fictional West End musical on the life of Rosie Poole, where the lead was being played by Harold O'Fay. And the purpose of that event, that performance lecture, was to try to kind of present this, as I say, this fresh new story about Rosie Poole, but also to kind of layer various kinds of interpretation in order to have the audience rethink about the transparency of the work that was being unveiled. So shortly after that, I moved to Cambridge, and in contrast to where I had lived in Brighton, there was a conspicuous lack of visibility of the queer community in Cambridge. I knew that there was one, but it certainly wasn't explicit or visible. So what I did in order to kind of really fill that out for myself was to go and interview, to talk to people from the community, but also to conduct oral history interviews with them in order to uncover a kind of the queer community in Cambridge and the queer past, a really thriving past, and the queer spaces of the city. We archived the interviews at the University Library, but it felt like there could be something more to be done here in terms of that vexation. That you could actually do something that would not only make the history, the queer history of Cambridge, accessible. Cambridge has a very strange population in that a huge number, it inflates with all of the students that come and then they leave after a few years. So the history is like a conveyor belt. It's very difficult to kind of get a handle on it. So the idea was to try and create a history that would be accessible and available year on year to people, but also to kind of chip away at that sense of fact and the kind of transparent presentation of evidence. So I created an audio trail of Cambridge that presented the oral histories that I had conducted alongside fictional excerpts from books that were set in Cambridge, like Ali Smith's 1997 book, Like, which is set in Cambridge. Ali Smith also lives in Cambridge, if you're interested. I know what street. Not stalking. And also Stephen Fry's book, best-selling book, The Liar, which is kind of vaguely based on the Cambridge Spies, a queer take on the Cambridge Spies. And the intention with that really was to challenge a kind of seamless presentation of fact and to kind of highlight the imaginative aspects and the way that place is in Bachelard's sense, like as imaginative as it is physical. And it was inspired by the work of artists like Graham Miller, who in his 2003 work Linked created an audio trail, an audio walk of the M11 Link Road in London, which used oral history or interviews with people who had lived in that area, whose neighborhoods and houses had been destroyed in order to make way for the road. So disappearance was a huge kind of concern of mine, and what had disappeared and what remained. Because I suppose we're all interested in arts and culture, you're probably thinking, where did the funding for that come from? It had no funding initially. It was just something that I wanted to get going on my own. But subsequently, we got a University Diversity Fund Award from the University of Cambridge in order to present this very attractive flyer. And the QR code does point, we love a QR code. It does point to that audio trail if you're interested. The Audio Trail Cambridge led on to a few other projects, including, I was commissioned by the arts organisation Climate Art to do a queer history audio trail of Rye, which is a town in the southeast of England, which is most famous for being the residence of Radcliffe Hall, Henry James, Edward Burrough, who all lived in this very strange little seaside town. And the purpose with that was to put the lives and stories of those very well-known figures side by side with more oral histories from older people in Rye, speaking about their experience. I also did a podcast with a drag king friend of mine named Orlando, where we did a queer road trip around the southeast of England and went to Prospect Cottage, which was Derek Jarman's home, and Sissinghurst Castle, where Vita Sackville West lived. And so to explore historic queer spaces, but we also went to places like Margate and Hastings, where community groups are really doing the very good work, in contrast to the large amount of bigotry and hatred of migrants and difference that has taken hold in those places, in that part of England. And most recently, I was involved in an augmented reality trail of Kings Lynn, which is a town near Cambridge, working with young people there to construct an augmented reality walk through the town that would reveal the history of the place. If you've ever worked with 20 young people, you'll know what I mean by it was a vexing experience for all concerned, but it was ultimately really brilliant. But I suppose the more traditional kind of queer cultural history that I've done is most recently was a book called Nothing Ever Just Disappears, which was published by Penguin in 2023. And it was really interested in the interconnections between place, sexuality, and creativity. I was interested in what sociologists call place responsiveness, which is the way that place impacts upon how you live, who you love, how you express your identity, the forms that identity takes. And so I was looking at various different kind of, case studies. E.M. Forster, the novelist, lived in Cambridge, which was quite handy because it was where I was living at the time. And I was interested in how his closeted sexuality could be mapped onto the very cloistered spaces of Cambridge and that management of private and public space. I went to Jersey in order to think about how Claude Cahun, the surrealist photographer and performance artist, what the importance of a place like Jersey, which is a bailiwick, which historically has been torn between Britain and France, And I thought that was a really interesting introduction to somebody who plays with gender indeterminacy so much in their work. And also people like Josephine Baker, who as a black bisexual woman found in 1920s Paris a kind of a life without limits. But the book didn't start as a book. It started, I mean, okay, so these are some of my successes, but there are also failures, okay? So this is The Queer Art of Failure. I was really interested in disappearing spaces and specifically in the gay bars and sex clubs in New York that had shut down because of the AIDS crisis. And I was really interested in how you would get people back to that time, back to those places. And also create some kind of critical distance where you are able to observe your relationship to it and your reaction to it, your nostalgia, your desire, your distance. So I thought the best way to do that would be through scale models. Inspired by the likes of, so at the time in 2019, 2020, two artists, Hannah Quinlan and Rosie Hastings, were exploring disappearing gay bars in their installation work. So I was really interested in that. I was also really interested in the work of Yinka Shonibare, whose doll houses that use kente cloth. They interrogate the kind of the imperialism of the British imperialism. So I found a master model maker in Deptford who went by the name of David Neat, which strikes me as nominative determinism if ever there were. So I went and did a course in scale model making. Now, I am not an Airfix kid, so it was really starting from the ground up. I made a Rococo chair and a small tree. But I'm afraid that was the extent of my scale modeling. So unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity to create those scale models of gay sex clubs in New York in the 1970s. There are lots of artists here. Feel free to take that idea forward. But as I say, it is about the queer art of failure. I am aware I'm coming to the end of my time. So I thought, Diarmuid, stick to your strengths here. So perhaps what you could do is create an immersive sense of exploration of space through writing, which was the kind of primary orientation of Nothing Ever Just Disappears. When I was thinking about this talk, something that Wendy Moffat, who's a queer cultural historian, also the biographer of E.M. Forrester, she said something that always resonated with me, which was the search for evidence of queer lives cannot be separated. That was great. Evidence of queer lives cannot be separated from the search for that evidence, which is to say, the subjective, emotive desire and intention of those who go to look for that evidence and look for that history. As a little addendum to that, I think it's important to think also that queer evidence cannot be separated from both the search for that evidence, but also how it's presented. And I think it's really important when we're thinking about how to do queer history, is to think about how it's presented and to stay a little bit vexed. Thank you. I'd also like to give a little shout out to the signers over here who are doing a stellar work, and so I really appreciate that, and appreciate Sean and Kate organising that as well.